Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. A green SUV sits under supermarket lights. Inside, a phone, a wallet, silence, no driver. In suburbs like Riverside, crime doesn't always shout. It erases a routine and leaves patterns that don't fit. The camera caught a hooded figure walking away. The data lined up almost too neatly, and sometimes that's the problem. This is the case of Cheryl L. Coker. What happened between a normal school drop-off and a car that shouldn't have been there. We begin with what is documented. The morning starts with a routine drop at the local high school. Later that day, Cheryl's SUV is located in the Kroger Plaza at Spinning Road and Burkhart Road. The vehicle is properly parked. The ignition is off. Her phone and wallet are still inside. That arrangement does not answer where she went, but it constrains how investigators frame the first hours. Phones and wallets are the tools of ordinary movement, calling, paying, identifying. Abandoning both narrows the reasonable explanations. In a parking lot, a perimeter is more than tape. Patrol units establish a protective box, log who approaches the vehicle, and preserve the immediate environment before weather and traffic degrade it. Body-worn cameras capture the car as found, window position, door alignment, visible belongings, any distinguishing marks on the exterior. The point is not to solve the case at the curb. The point is to freeze the moment so the laboratory can work without guesswork. Technicians treat the SUV as a surrogate scene. They do not claim it is where a homicide occurred or even where an assault was attempted. They process it because it is the one place we know Cheryl's day goes off track. The priority is high-yield contact areas, interior door pulls, the steering wheel rim, the shift lever, seatbelt hardware, and the exterior driver's side handle. They expect touch DNA. They dust for latent prints on window switches, the rear-view mirror mount, and the center console face. Every item is photographed, bagged, labeled, and logged for chain of custody. The phone is placed in a Faraday sleeve to prevent remote tampering. The wallet is inventoried by content and position. No one announces conclusions. The record is built step by step. The lot itself becomes a grid. Investigators move outward from the vehicle in measured lanes, scanning for small but telling material, receipts, torn packaging, textile fibers that could transfer between clothing and seat fabric. Shopping carts within a short radius are checked for contact marks that match a person steadying themselves after exit. Suburban plazas produce visual noise, leaves, dust, ordinary litter. The job is to separate the ordinary from the relevant without importing drama that isn't there. Surveillance is the second asset. Property staff map the camera coverage, storefront domes, pole-mounted lot cameras, loading dock views. Detectives request full exports for the period surrounding the car's arrival, not clipped segments. In one angle, a person in dark clothing steps from the driver's side and walks away at a normal pace. The hood is up. The lighting is harsh. Color under sodium lamps is unreliable. What looks black at night can be navy or charcoal. There is no facial identification. What the clip supplies is time and direction of departure. That is enough to organize the next steps without inventing more than the video shows. Canvas follows the timeline. Employees and regular shoppers recall little because nothing dramatic happens at the moment the car is parked. No confrontation, no sprint, no struggle. That is why offenders favor staging in public view. Routine is camouflage. Detectives gather store door logs, examine potential reflection captures in front windows, and mark any second vehicle that appears to shadow, arrive just before, or leave just after the SUV. A nearby car with a driver waiting, engine on, lights off, matters more than a hooded silhouette everyone has already seen. Inside the SUV, the phone and wallet are the quiet center of gravity. Without extracting content, technicians can document state, visible notifications, lock screen time, battery level, whether the handset is connected to a charger, and whether the car's Bluetooth shows a recent pairing. Later, with proper authorization, analysts can look at call records and basic activity to understand whether the device went dark or simply stopped being used. Bank activity linked to the wallet's cards will be checked for transactions after the vehicle is found. None of that is speculation. It is basic digital hygiene in a modern missing person turned homicide investigation. Results are not announced here because the public record does not supply them in detail. We stay with what is on paper. Language matters. We do not call the Kroger lot a crime scene. We call it a staging or abandonment site because that is what the evidence supports. We do not describe blood, cleanup, or a home scene because those points are not in the public record. Consistency matters more than color. The same discipline holds for geography. The through line for this case never leaves three places: the Riverside routine, the Kroger lot at Spinning and Burkhart, and, later in the investigation, the recovery location in Greene County. Viewers have complained when cases feel like two different stories stitched together. That does not happen here. The path you follow now is the path you will be on at the end. There is a practical reason to linger on ordinary details like parking posture and ignition state. Offenders who plan a public drop often prefer no alarm. A car parked within the lines, lights off, windows up, looks like it belongs. A person exiting at a normal pace reads as nothing. The question is whether its very neatness is the tell. As one investigator put it during a briefing, the pattern was almost too clean. Sometimes that is the problem, the appearance of normal, where normal cannot explain the missing person. You may ask, if a person wanted to leave on their own, would they lock a phone and wallet inside a car that would be found quickly? If a second person wanted to signal a story, would they arrange the car and contents to be discovered under cameras? Those are not rhetorical flourishes, they are investigative filters. Each possibility drives different tasks: reviewing transit feeds and ride-share zones versus reviewing adjacency vehicles and repeated appearances of the same unfamiliar car over multiple days. The point, again, is process over drama. For viewers in communities like Riverside, this is the discomfort. Crimes in quiet towns rarely announce themselves. They interrupt a pattern, take a person out of their routine, and leave you staring at what remains. Here, what remains is a properly parked SUV under lights, a phone and wallet that should not have been left behind, and a hooded figure who chose an ordinary exit. That is enough to begin, and it is exactly as far as the public record allows us to go in this opening segment. Going forward, we will explain how investigators evaluate personal history and domestic context without turning it into a verdict. Context sets risk. It does not assign guilt. That sequencing matters, especially in a case where the first strong physical picture, the car, tells you almost nothing about who walked away. To keep the narrative coherent, a quick promise about structure. We will not repeat these vehicle facts unless there is new legal meaning. How the presentation of the SUV intersects with charging decisions, for example. We will not introduce new locations. We will not upgrade the lot to a primary scene. We will add layers only when the record supports them: search activity, recovery, pathology, prosecutorial review, and the single consistent ending that the case has today. In Riverside, Ohio, routine is the anchor. When investigators looked past the green SUV and into Cheryl L. Coker's life, they were not seeking drama. They were building a profile that could explain why an ordinary morning ended at a supermarket lot. This is the part of an investigation that feels quiet from the outside. Files, calendars, call histories, but it's where direction is earned. In towns like Riverside, crimes aren't just crimes. They unsettle the pattern a community depends on. Victimology starts with what is known and verifiable. Cheryl was a middle-aged mother with daily obligations that typically leave a heavy paper trail: school runs, work coordination, family communication, errands. Investigators collect those anchors and set up a baseline: what a normal weekday looks like for her in texts, calls, banking, and vehicle use. The aim is not to label anyone, it's to measure deviation. If a person who texts frequently stops midday with no pickup later that evening, that gap gets weight. If bank cards that see daily activity go silent, that silence is calculated against work and family needs. The green SUV is the visual, but these non-visual signals determine where to point resources. The first decisions in a case like this revolve around narrowing theories without locking into one too soon. Voluntary absence, medical emergency, or criminal interference. Every missing person case begins there. Cheryl's phone and wallet inside the parked car constrain those possibilities. A person who chooses to leave usually takes currency, identification, and communication. A person who suffers a medical emergency in public is usually found or reported quickly. When neither occurs, investigators move the slider toward third-party involvement without declaring it. That is the procedural discipline. Understand the likely, preserve the possible. With the baseline set, the team moves to behavioral triage, recent stressors, disputes, and any life change that ups risk without assigning blame. Public records show a divorce filing shortly before she disappeared. That matters as context, not as verdict. In intimate partner homicides nationwide, relationship dissolution is a known risk factor. It tells police to check proximity, opportunity, and recent access, not to announce a conclusion. The line is clear in a professional file. Context guides direction. Evidence carries burden. If the audience takes anything from this section, let it be that distinction. Digital traces then become the quiet proof of what a day should look like. Analysts examine phone activity at a high level, no content needed at this stage, to determine whether Cheryl's device followed her habitual pattern of pings, notifications, and screen activations. They document changes around the time the SUV was parked. Was the phone charging? Did the device pair with the vehicle's Bluetooth? Did it remain local or go dark? Banking is reviewed for card present or card not present transactions after the car was located. Any hit would force a different search pattern. Social accounts are checked for logins, edits, or location anomalies. None of this is speculative. It's standard practice. Specific lab outcomes are not public in detail, so this report stays at the level the record supports. Investigators also examine commitments that tend to survive stress, appointments, childcare responsibilities, and routine errands scheduled that week. People who intend to leave usually untangle some of those obligations first. People who do not intend to leave them tangled. When a case is built largely on absence, these downstream details can be decisive. If a prescription pickup expected that afternoon never happens, that is 1 point. If a work obligation that would normally trigger calls goes unanswered without explanation, that is another. Points collect, direction gets firmer. Next comes the social perimeter. Detectives interview family, friends, co-workers, and neighbors with a clear purpose. Define the last known contacts, identify any conflict in the days leading up to the disappearance, and capture routine deviations. This is not about mining emotion. It's about corroboration. Did anyone see Cheryl after the school drop? Did anyone expect her at a specific time for a specific task? Did anyone notice an unfamiliar vehicle near her home in the week prior? In a suburban setting, cars are noticed. Faces may not be. Notes from these conversations are cross-checked against camera canvases from the plaza and the streets that connect it to the neighborhood. The SUV's presentation continues to feed the triage. A properly parked car with core personal items left inside often indicates staging. That word is chosen carefully. Staging is about managing what will be found, how fast it will be found, and by whom. When investigators teach new officers to read staging, they emphasize the contradiction to look for: organization in the display, disorder in the underlying story. The hooded figure leaving the driver's door calmly is organization. The abrupt stop to a mother's communications and obligations is disorder. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that is the problem. At the same time, investigators guard against tunnel vision. A voluntary departure can still be staged to appear like a third-party act. To test that, detectives look for advanced planning signals: cash withdrawals, unusual purchases consistent with travel, searches for transport routes, storage rentals, or contacts with shelters. They check whether a second set of car keys is missing, whether passports are accessible, whether belongings that matter personally but not publicly, jewelry with sentimental value, family keepsakes, were removed. The absence of those indicators does not prove coercion, but it removes easy alternate narratives with fewer invasive steps. In a case built on small increments, geography keeps the file honest. The narrative does not leave Riverside and the Kroger Plaza. The next time geography changes in this report, it will be to the recovery location in Greene County, and it will change only once. This is not two stories sewn together. It is a single line from a morning routine to a parked vehicle with a phone and wallet inside to a later discovery that shifts the legal posture. Viewers lose patience when cases drift. The file doesn't drift here. One more element belongs in this chapter because it shapes public expectations. Nothing in this section accuses anyone. That's intentional. The job at this point is to rank risk factors, not to name a perpetrator. The audience will hear a name later in this series when the official record does, and even then, the language stays precise. Suspect, not convicted offender. Allegation, not established fact. You can demand accountability and still respect the proof standard. That is how a case earns its conclusion in court, not just online. For those watching who live in small cities and suburbs, the human point is short and practical. Routines keep people safe because they make departures obvious. When someone you know drops off the map in a way that breaks their pattern, do not rationalize it alone. Document the last contacts, preserve devices as they are, and report what you know. Early clarity preserves evidence, late clarity often only preserves regret. Riverside police moved fast from the parking lot to the lab and back to the neighborhood grid. The goal wasn't a headline, it was a workable timeline that could stand up in court. The green SUV was documented exactly as found, then towed for controlled processing. Every transfer risk was logged. Evidence technicians worked standard high-yield contact points inside and out, packaged the phone in a Faraday sleeve, and booked the wallet separately with a clean chain of custody. No one at the scene declared a theory. That restraint protects cases, especially crime scenes built more on absence than injury. From there, the case widened through cameras. Store security provided a full export, not just a clip, so detectives could see arrival patterns before and after the SUV was parked. Adjacent businesses were contacted with preservation requests and a time window for pulls. Frame-by-frame review fixed a narrow window for when the driver's door opened and the hooded figure walked away at an unhurried pace. Pole spacing and fixed objects were used to estimate height with a tolerance range. Light distortion under sodium lamps was noted to avoid overreading color. The video didn't give identity. It gave reliable time anchors and direction of travel. That matters more than a dramatic image. Canvas teams worked outward from the lot along the obvious foot routes, sidewalks toward the road, cut-throughs between buildings, and confirmed the ordinary. No audible disturbance, no visible struggle, no 911 call tied to that moment. In towns like Riverside, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The absence of a public alarm is data. It supports the read that the vehicle was left to be found without drawing attention. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Back at the lab, digital hygiene proceeded on a parallel track. Without breaching content, analysts documented the handset's state as booked, screen, battery, visible notifications, and later checked routine technical points, whether the device had been on charge when the ignition was last cut, whether the vehicle's infotainment showed a recent Bluetooth pairing, and whether basic call records indicated activity around the parking event. Banking tied to the wallet's cards was flagged for any use after the vehicle was recovered. Card-present hits would have altered the search pattern immediately. Public records don't list those outcomes in detail, so the responsible conclusion here is procedural. The checks were done. Only verified results feed decisions. The first interviews focused on establishing last contacts and expected obligations. Investigators took down who spoke to Cheryl most recently, who expected her later that day, and what tasks or appointments were on her calendar. Those details aren't gossip, they are friction points. A missed pickup, an unanswered work commitment, a prescription left waiting. Each item is a quiet data point that separates voluntary absence from third-party interference. When people intend to leave, they usually move money and tie off obligations. When people do not, the loose ends stay visible. With the camera timestamps, the device booking, and the first wave of interviews, the working picture took shape. A properly parked car, essential items left inside, a non-panicked exit captured on video, and no immediate downstream activity that would explain a planned departure. That doesn't prove a perpetrator, it just pushes resources toward third-party involvement. Patrol units were reassigned to recheck the roads linking the plaza back to the neighborhood. Detectives requested wider footage where traffic cameras might show a second car that arrives close in time to the SUV and departs shortly after. The goal was to find association, not a license plate on day one. Throughout, the files stayed disciplined on geography. The story remained in Riverside and the Kroger lot. No new scene was introduced. There was no claim of blood, no cleanup, No in-home seizure of evidence that isn't in the record. What existed was a controlled vehicle presentation and a timeline tightened by surveillance. That's enough to build Chapter 4 on firmer ground. When the classification of the case changes and the language used by law enforcement changes with it. A brief human note belongs here. Families live minute to minute in the first 3 days. Investigators live document to document. Those tracks can feel at odds. The best work happens when the case report stays exact and the outreach stays compassionate. Early clarity preserves evidence. Late clarity rarely does. When a case crosses from disappearance to homicide, the language changes first. Behind that change is a checklist. The abrupt stop to communications and banking, essential items left behind, a vehicle placed where it will be found, and no credible sign of a voluntary exit. Riverside detectives presented that totality to supervisors and to state partners. The file moved, quietly but decisively, into a homicide investigation. That shift doesn't declare who committed a crime, it declares what kind of event best fits the evidence. The decision unlocked tools that weren't available during the initial missing person phase. Prosecutors were briefed. Additional warrants were drafted. The Ohio State Lab and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation widened support. Tip lines were republicized, but the internal focus tightened. Establish an offender pathway that explains the car, the phone, the wallet, and the calm walk-away on camera. The working theory prioritized staging. Not because it was dramatic, but because it accounted for more of the facts with fewer assumptions. With the classification formalized, Riverside Police made a public statement, "This is a homicide investigation." In that same announcement, they named a sole suspect, William Bill Coker, while emphasizing that no one had been charged. That distinction matters in American law. Naming a suspect acknowledges direction. Filing charges asserts that there is admissible evidence sufficient to move a case into court. The former can mobilize the public for tips, the latter must survive a judge, and eventually a jury. Inside the case room, the standard of proof became the central constraint. Probable cause is the low bar needed for a warrant, a reasonable basis to believe evidence of a crime is present in the place to be searched. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is the high bar needed for conviction. Many homicide files live in the wide distance between those two lines. Riverside investigators took care not to confuse them. The video told them when and where the SUV was vacated. It didn't tell them who placed it or what happened off camera. The abandoned essentials argued against a voluntary disappearance. They didn't identify a killer. The digital quiet supported the homicide classification. It didn't establish means or location. The strategy turned to building a prosecutable narrative without a primary scene. Warrants sought communications records, location-adjacent footage beyond the plaza, and access to vehicles or properties with logical links to the victim's day. Interview strategy evolved too. First-pass interviews that had sounded neutral were reapproached with tighter timelines and specific follow-ups. The phrasing of questions changed from, "When did you last speak to her?" to, "Explain the 10-minute window between these two time-stamped events." That's not aggression, it's precision. A homicide designation demands it. Naming a suspect publicly carried its own risks. It risks tunnel vision if the team lets the label pull evidence into its orbit. It risks public prejudgment, which can scare off marginal witnesses who fear involvement. To counter that, the case file kept two lanes open. The primary lane pursuing the publicly named suspect, and a verification lane reserved for disconfirming data. If a new tip or artifact contradicted the favored reading of the car or the video, it had to be documented and tested, not explained away. That discipline keeps cases honest and keeps them alive if the first theory falters. The plaza footage was remined with this higher standard in mind. Detectives looked not just for a hooded figure, but for behaviors that suggest coordination. A vehicle idling out of frame that leaves within a minute of the SUV being parked, a driver whose head position tracks the walkaway path, a repeated car that appears on several days leading up to the disappearance. Any one item can be ordinary. Several together begin to look like logistics. When investigators teach younger officers how to read circumstantial mosaics, they focus on link density and temporal proximity, how many connections, how close in time. Digital forensics advanced in parallel under warrant. Analysts reviewed call records and routing data permissible under law to determine whether the victim's device or devices associated with known contacts plotted a pattern that matched the plaza timing. Here, the absence of a primary scene remained the handicap. Without a definitive location of violence, digital artifacts can suggest intersection but may not prove intent or action. That's why the homicide classification matters. It allows the state to push harder for records and to spend the time needed to turn faint correlations into credible timelines. Why then, no immediate arrest? Because a homicide announcement is not a shortcut around the burden of proof. Without a body at that point in the timeline, without a known cause of death, and without a primary scene, the evidentiary package was still largely circumstantial. Strong circumstantial cases are charged every day in the United States. Weak ones fail in front of juries who expect a method, a location, or an admission. Riverside's posture reflected that reality. Move too soon, and you risk a failed case you can't reset. Move too slow, and you risk losing witnesses and momentum. The choice to reclassify publicly while holding back on charges sits exactly in that tension. The human cost of that decision isn't theoretical. Families hear homicide and expect resolution to accelerate. Instead, the work often gets slower and more exacting. The team must re-verify every previous step. Who last saw Cheryl? What obligations were missed? What path a second vehicle could plausibly take without triggering a camera? Whether anyone's statements shift when shown precise timestamps. In towns like Riverside, people want that work done right the first time. So do the investigators. A case anchored in procedure stands longer than one anchored in assumptions. This is also where community restraint matters. When police name a suspect without filing, social media can run a parallel trial. That noise rarely helps. It can contaminate witness memory, complicate jury selection later, and pressure the case into public gambits instead of quiet verification. The responsible course is the less satisfying one. Narrow the timeline further, test the staging hypothesis against new polls and interviews, and examine the life of the named suspect and the victim for previously missed points of contact or opportunity. Tips that come in after a homicide announcement are logged, triaged, and either feed the main line or get filed as non-actionable. The file grows. The story stays linear. By the end of this phase, the case looked different than it did when the SUV was first found. It had a formal label that matched the facts on the table. It had a publicly named suspect and a clear reminder that naming is not charging. It had warrants, re-interviews, and lab work built for court, not for television. And it had a path forward that accepted the hardest truth of circumstantial homicide work. Even with direction, the missing pieces still have to be earned. Once the case carried a homicide designation, the work expanded from a single lot to the roads that could explain it. Investigators mapped the natural corridors in and out of Riverside, prioritizing the routes a quiet, daytime driver would pick to avoid attention. Arterials that feed quickly to side streets, and side streets that lead to county lines. Patrol units were detailed to rerun these stretches during the same hours the SUV appeared at the Kroger Plaza, logging cameras, traffic patterns, and potential choke points where a second vehicle might have waited out of frame. The goal was practical. Find the most likely pathway that connects a calm walk-away on surveillance to whatever came next, without inventing a scene that isn't in the record. Searches were structured, not speculative. Teams divided the area around Spinning Road and Burkhart Road into controlled grids, then pushed outward to cover edges where a person on foot could transition to a pickup. Drainage easements, alleys, and shortcut trails behind businesses were checked for disposed items that could matter. Clothing remnants, paper with trace handwriting, a wipe-down cloth, anything that would look out of place in a suburban service lane. Negative results were logged and kept. In this kind of crime work, we found nothing is data. It eliminates directions and keeps the file honest about what has and hasn't been tested. Parallel to the ground searches, the paper moved. With the reclassification, detectives obtained broader warrants, full DVR exports from adjacent businesses that shared parking lot sightlines, authorization for longer retention windows, and targeted pulls from traffic cameras along the most probable departure routes. The request language was precise. Time bands tied to the moment the SUV was parked, camera IDs by location, and a requirement to keep native file formats for forensic authenticity. Investigators weren't looking for a cinematic shot of a face. They were building continuity. A vehicle that appears near the lot, vanishes for 10 minutes, then reappears 2 blocks away within the same window is more valuable than a blurry still. Digital traces followed the same discipline. With proper legal process, analysts reviewed call detail records for the hours surrounding the vehicle's appearance. The purpose wasn't to announce a cell site map. It was to test whether known contacts devices intersected in time with the window established by video. Email and messaging timestamps associated with key accounts were placed on a single line with camera events to see if any message coincided suspiciously with the walkaway. Banking holds were extended so any late clearing card use could ping the case team in real time. If nothing hit, that silence tightened the staging hypothesis. If something did, it would redirect resources immediately. Either way, the method stands. Interviews were reopened with tighter prompts. People previously asked broad questions were shown time-stamped frames and asked to account for short windows that now mattered. The phrasing shifted from, "What do you remember?" to, "Explain your movements between these two times." That difference forces clarity without accusation. Anyone whose story drifted was interviewed again by a second investigator and, if needed, under recorded conditions. The case didn't need speeches, it needed verifiable positions. As search activity scaled, the team resisted two common traps. The first is the tendency to treat every tip as a breakthrough. A homicide file is healthiest when tips are triaged through a single lens. Does this information intersect the established window or the mapped corridors in a way that can be verified? The second trap is building the case backwards from a favored theory. To counter that, the file kept one verification lane open. Any lead that logically contradicted the staging picture was tested before it was dismissed. If a report placed the victim somewhere that would challenge the plaza timeline, the team pulled that camera too. If a caller claimed a sighting that couldn't survive a simple distance and time test, it was archived and marked non-actionable. Discipline is not pessimism, it's how a case survives scrutiny. Community participation mattered here, but not in the way television suggests. What helps most is simple and specific: dates, times, car descriptions, and directions of travel. Riverside residents who offered detail at that level gave the case real edges. In small cities and suburbs, people remember familiar cars on their street and notice strangers who park just long enough to watch. Those notes, when they matched a corridor or a time band from the DVR polls, were the kind of low-drama addition that actually moves an investigation forward. By the close of this phase, the file had more than an empty car and a hooded silhouette. It held mapped routes, negative search logs that narrowed disposal zones, expanded video blocks that anchored a departure window, and a refined list of interviews that fit, or didn't fit, the tightened timeline. None of that revealed a primary scene. The record still doesn't establish one. But it built a framework sturdy enough to support what the case would soon have to accept. If a body is later found, the corridor work will explain how the story got from a supermarket lot in Riverside to a recovery site beyond it, without turning the narrative into two different stories. Investigators had already spent months piecing together fragments of Cheryl Coker's disappearance. The plaza surveillance, the cell site pings, and the search perimeters all pointed in one direction. The life of a 46-year-old mother had ended without explanation. By this stage, the case file grew thicker with reports, but still thinner on the one thing detectives needed most: direct physical evidence tying the suspect to the crime. One forensic angle gained more weight in 2020 when human remains were located in a wooded area of Greene County, several miles from Cheryl's home in Riverside, Ohio. The recovery was delayed, scattered, and weathered. What was brought back to the coroner's office was incomplete skeletal material. No clothing of value was preserved, and environmental exposure had stripped away much of the trace evidence investigators had hoped to find. Forensic anthropology confirmed the remains belonged to Cheryl through dental records and DNA comparison with her family. The cause of death, however, was listed as undetermined. That single line on the coroner's report would haunt the case file from then on. From a procedural standpoint, this created a difficult situation. A body had been found, closing the missing person status, but no medical determination could establish homicide beyond circumstantial grounds. Detectives leaned harder into the digital and testimonial evidence already gathered. They built timelines showing that Cheryl's known movements ended the morning she dropped her daughter off at school. From there, her phone activity ceased, her SUV was abandoned, and only indirect surveillance hints suggested who had access. Attention turned back to William Bill Coker. Interviews documented his strained marriage with Cheryl. Several friends and family members told investigators that Cheryl was preparing to leave him and that she had voiced fears about how he might react. Search warrants obtained for his phone and computer activity revealed patterns of interest, but not an explicit confession or direct proof of disposal. For detectives, the challenge was converting suspicion into a prosecutable case, something that would withstand a defense attorney's scrutiny in court. The coroner's ruling complicated that process. Without a listed cause of death, such as blunt force trauma, strangulation, or gunshot wound, prosecutors would be left to argue homicide by circumstance. It has been done before, but it is a higher burden. Defense could argue that Cheryl's death in the woods was unrelated to foul play, despite the implausibility. This legal deadlock is a common obstacle in unresolved cases, especially when remains are located long after decomposition has taken its toll. On the human side, Cheryl's family now had confirmation of her death, but no closure on accountability. Investigators publicly named Bill as the prime suspect in 2019, a year before the remains were located. Yet even after her body was recovered, charges were not filed. Detectives kept assembling reports, hoping one overlooked piece of evidence might push the case over the threshold. For viewers of crime cases like this, the critical question emerges. How much weight should a jury place on circumstantial evidence when the forensic science cannot provide a cause of death? It's a question that splits opinions, and one that prosecutors in Ohio faced head-on in this investigation. Once Cheryl's remains had been confirmed in Greene County, investigators shifted their focus almost entirely to the evidentiary threads that had been collected years earlier but not yet tested under the scrutiny of a potential trial. The challenge was clear. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined. That meant the case would hinge on what detectives could prove through digital forensics, surveillance, and witness testimony. One of the strongest tools in the case file was digital analysis. Investigators had secured cell phone records for both Cheryl and Bill from October 2018. Cheryl's phone went dark after the morning she left her daughter at school. From that moment, no outgoing calls, no texts, and no data usage were recorded. By contrast, Bill's device showed activity consistent with him being near Riverside during the critical hours. The pattern revealed he had opportunities to intercept Cheryl, though no GPS-level precision could establish the exact encounter point. Still, analysts mapped his movements with tower-to-tower connections that placed him in areas consistent with the later discovery of her SUV. Parallel to the phone records, video surveillance footage from a nearby business plaza showed Cheryl's vehicle being parked and later abandoned. A figure in dark clothing was seen walking away, though the resolution was too poor to provide a conclusive identification. Investigators and prosecutors would later characterize that clip as supportive but not definitive. The testimonies of Cheryl's family and friends carried weight as well. They consistently reported that she had been planning to leave Bill, that she was unhappy in the marriage, and that she feared his reaction. While hearsay cannot prove homicide, the statements built a narrative framework that aligned with the circumstantial evidence already gathered. In criminal investigations, these overlapping layers of digital data, surveillance, and personal testimony often combine to provide a picture stronger than any single strand of evidence alone. Law enforcement also reviewed Bill's digital footprint. Search histories, online activity, and financial transactions were examined for indications of premeditation or cover-up. While no explicit smoking gun was located, patterns of behavior reinforced the profile of a man under pressure, facing the potential collapse of his domestic life. Such context, while not dispositive, strengthens the circumstantial web. The problem remained prosecutorial discretion. To bring a case forward without a determined cause of death and without forensic evidence directly connecting Bill to Cheryl's remains would require the district attorney to commit to a circumstantial homicide prosecution. These cases have succeeded in the past, but they demand a jury willing to weigh digital breadcrumbs against the absence of physical proof. In Riverside, Ohio, the standard remained high and prosecutors hesitated to move forward. At this point, the investigation reached an uneasy standstill. Detectives had effectively reached the limit of what the evidence could provide. They had assembled timelines, secured records, interviewed witnesses, and presented their findings. Yet, without the final piece, a cause of death or direct forensic tie, The case could not cross into formal charges. For Cheryl's family, this represented the most painful kind of limbo. They had confirmation of her death, confirmation of a prime suspect, but no trial, no verdict, and no formal closure. The open case designation underscored a reality of many true crime investigations. Not every file reaches a courtroom. The viewer is left with a question central to this case and others like it. Should prosecutors pursue charges when the case is built entirely on circumstantial grounds, even when the suspect is the spouse and the evidence points consistently in that direction? By the time investigators in Riverside, Ohio had pieced together the timeline of Cheryl Coker's disappearance, the case had already spanned years. Cheryl was last seen in October 2018 after dropping off her daughter at school. In 2020, her skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area not far from the city. The autopsy could not determine an exact cause of death, leaving the most critical forensic question unresolved. Yet the weight of circumstantial and digital evidence consistently pointed toward her husband, William Bill Coker. Detectives made their position clear. Bill was the prime suspect. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and inconsistencies in his behavior placed him at the center of the investigation. But the case never reached a courtroom. In 2022, before prosecutors could bring charges, Bill took his own life. That act closed off the possibility of trial, cross-examination, or conviction. What remained was a case permanently open, technically unsolved, but with a narrative most investigators felt confident about. For Cheryl's family, the outcome was devastating. They received partial answers, confirmation that Cheryl had been killed, but no full measure of justice. For law enforcement, the suicide of their only suspect meant a file that would likely never move forward, preserved in its open status but functionally stalled. It is a scenario not uncommon in true crime. The trail leads directly to one person, but that person's death eliminates the possibility of formal accountability. This crime story is more than a case file. It is also a portrait of the gaps that can remain even after years of police work and community attention. Cheryl's daughter grew up with the public knowledge that her mother was taken, and that the man who should have been most trusted was the one investigators named. Riverside itself carries the memory of a family torn apart, and of justice that could only be partly delivered. The unresolved ending reminds us of the limits of the criminal justice system. Even when investigators close in, even when evidence seems overwhelming, the process depends on the presence of the accused. When that link is broken, the questions remain unanswered for families and for society. Cheryl Coker's name joins the list of women whose lives were cut short under circumstances marked by betrayal and secrecy. And while her case remains officially open, the practical ending was written with Bill Coker's death. When I look back at Cheryl Coker's story, what stays with me is not only the tragedy of her loss, but the lessons it leaves for all of us. Crime is not just a headline. It reshapes families, children, and entire communities. As a narrator, I've tried to walk you through the evidence and the unanswered questions, but I also hope you see the deeper truth. Awareness, vigilance, and speaking up when something feels wrong can save lives. Justice doesn't always arrive in the form of a courtroom verdict, but we can honor victims by refusing to let their stories fade. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe a case should ever be considered closed if the main suspect dies, or should it remain open until every detail is answered? Share your perspective in the comments. I truly want to know how you see it. And if this video touched you, let me know where you're watching from or what part of Cheryl's story struck you the most. If you didn't enjoy it, tell me why. I'm always open to improving. Most importantly, if you want to join me as we uncover more real true crime stories, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss what's coming next.